Donkor.
Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody. Sure. Thank you. That's more like it. So, my name is Arit Okpo, and I will be enjoying a wonderful book conversation at the Ake Festival with Chibundu Onuzo, who we have all concluded has two heads, and Michael Donkor. Let's start by asking, how many people have read Welcome to Lagos? Okay. How many people have read Hold? There will be spoilers. Let me just tell you now. But I think that at the end of this conversation, you will rush to buy both books because they gave such a fascinating journey in different ways. So I'm going to ask us all to please settle down. If we can pay attention, it's you know, when you're talking among yourselves in the audience, nobody sees you, but we are here, so we're just watching all of you chatting and ignoring us. Anyway, so we're going to go ahead and start the conversation. We'll talk a little bit and then, of course, open questions to the audience. And Michael, I will start with you because Hold takes us through a very interesting journey. And one of the journeys it took us through was one with language. Mm-hmm. You used a very specific sort of sentence structure in the book. I'm going to just read a couple of sentences so that you understand. And then you also did something which has been the source of a lot of debate, which is putting some words, some twee words with interpretations, and then leaving the rest for us to figure out in context. So for us to have a kind of idea of some of the sentence arrangements that we're talking about, we have a passage where Belinda, who is, I would say, the main character, is saying, I thank God for all the blessings we receive in this house. Auntie and uncle have shown a big kindness to me, and to Mary also. It's miracle my mother saw the small card for this job in Adum post office. Miracle, pa. I believe the Almighty helped them choose me. So, very interesting way of arranging words. Why did you do all those connections?
Well, I suppose when I was thinking about the dialogue in the novel, I wanted it to be as creative and imaginative as the other aspects of the novel. So the narration is experimental in all sorts of ways, and I wanted to play around with the way that people speak and use language. So I didn't want the characters to have to follow the kind of standard rules of conversation that we might all be familiar with. I wanted to try and do something a bit new and different, and primarily for their dialogue, for their speech, to reflect something about who they are. So sometimes with Belinda, for example, the main character in the novel, she's quite a reserved figure. And so her speech is quite hesitant, or it's a bit kind of fragmented. So I wanted to do things with the ways that the characters were communicating that told you even more about who they were. I suppose the other thing about kind of introducing some Twi words into the novel, into the dialogue, because the novel is set in Ghana and Twi is the kind of predominant language spoken in Ghana. The reason why I wanted to include that and to move between Twi and English and to have some words explained in the glossary, with Twi terms and English terms, but then to leave some terms unexplained, was because that kind of reflected my experience of Twi, in that I'm not a very good Twi speaker at all, terrible Twi speaker, but I grew up in a household where my mum was speaking Twi all the time on the phone to relatives back home. When aunts and uncles came over, they'd be speaking Twi, but they would move between the two languages very fluidly without explaining when they were jumping from one to the next. And I wanted to try and replicate that in the way that the characters were communicating.
It did come through very clearly. Let me ask, just for like to see your perspectives. You know that there's this ongoing debate where people who write mostly from the continent are divided into two camps. So in one camp, it's like, if you're going to use local words, then you must interpret them, give us a glossary. And then there are some others that are like, look, when you read the passage, use the passage to decide explain what it means. Yeah. So who believes that we should have glossaries to explain these terms? Okay, and who is like, let the context decide the words? Okay, all right. So you're going to see a lot of that with Hold.
Yeah.
And now Chibundu. Chibundu wrote a book that is so poetic in its expression that I would stop sometimes just because I wanted to enjoy the way she used words. And I think the first thing that caught me, the very first time it happened, was when she was talking about the officers going to the mess, and she was like describing them. Officers and lower ranks sauntered into the building in an assortment of mufti, woolen bobble hats and black T-shirts, wrappers knotted over the arm or tied around the waist, the slovenly slap of slippers flip-flopping their way inside. Like, I stopped. I just needed to enjoy that, you know. One thing the novel also does is it jarred me a bit, because there were things that you wrote that felt like we heard about them in the 80s, but then you would contrast them with modern day so that it sometimes felt like I was back and forth in time. Was that deliberate?
First of all, go down low. You have to give me an example of what you mean by the back and forth.
Okay, there were times when you would describe the news office in ways that I've read news offices in the 80s when we were in the military era. And then all of a sudden it would be like, oh, but the web pages are going, the views are going up. And I'd remember that, oh, we're in the 21st century. It kind of gave me a sense of the more things change, the more they remain the same. You know, so was that deliberate or something that you just found happening?
Actually, that's a very interesting question. And this is why, you know, first of all, it's good to be back home, to be talking about this book in front of a Nigerian audience. It's good to be talking to a moderator that knows how to pronounce my name. And that's a very interesting comment you make up actually about shifting back and forth, because I wasn't born in the 80s, but I left Nigeria when I was 14. And then I moved away. And I remember growing up in Nigeria, especially under the military dictatorships, there was a lot of oppression and arresting of journalists and throwing them in jail and all of that. And then I lived through that. And then I moved away and moved to England. And I remember when Next came out. And again, you know, Next, because of their cutting-edge journalism and because of the kind of stories they broke, they again were targeted by the government. And then, you know, I think there was a time where they sent some men with guns to their office and so on and so forth. And so I was reading about these stories on the internet. And I wasn't living in Nigeria at the time. And so I suppose, yes, you're right. The newspaper is a sort of blend of the newspaper culture I remember from living in Nigeria and then the newspaper culture I read about from the internet about Nigeria. Yeah, you're right.
So you can say I read the book well. You also take us through 6 characters who play different roles, you know. One would ask why you needed 6 perspectives. That's one question. The second is that both of the women in that story, both of the main, Isoken and Amma, had a lot of trauma. But then you mentioned the trauma and it seemed like you just dropped it. Why did you do that? First, why the 6 characters? What did they bring to the story? And then why that treatment of the women's trauma in that way where it happened and then we just keep going?
So I started off writing the novel wanting to write a novel with a large cast of characters. So I just read a book called Sea of Poppies, and it had a large cast of characters and they go on an adventure. And so I was like, I want to write a book with a large cast of characters. And actually, there were more than 6. So what happened was, every chapter, somebody new would just rock up. You know, they would just rock up into the story. And at a point, I probably had about 12 or 13 major characters. And I gave it to my editor to read, and she was just like, there are too many. There are too, like, somebody would be speaking, you're like, who is this again? Who is this person? And so I actually had to, you know, get rid of some of the characters. And so I describe it as a sort of, you know, selective massacre. You know, I lined them up against the wall and I said, justify your place in this book. And if you couldn't justify your place in this book, bang, 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 gone. Exactly.
And what about the women with how their trauma was? See, I told you there are going to be spoilers. I'm really sorry. But Isoken deals with some sexual violence. And Amma is a victim of domestic abuse. And those are the things that influence this journey. But you mentioned, like, Oma's situation is said and you literally just leave it and she keeps going. you know. And the same thing with Isoken. One day she realizes fine boy is not her enemy. So was it deliberate that you wanted to tell their trauma but not make it their personalities? Or did it just not have much relevance to the rest of the story?
All of them meet, they're all escaping, all the characters are escaping something different. And they all meet on the road to Lagos. And their story kind of continues from there, where they get to Lagos and have adventures. And I don't actually give that much backstory for any of the characters. Like they jam, and then they get to Lagos, and the story continues. And I think actually, especially in a place like Lagos, often people don't know people's past histories and past struggles. You just meet them, and then you just continue from there. And I mean, again, the question of domestic violence is only as an adult that I'm realizing how prevalent it was, and people I knew or people I know, and it was only in my 20s that I'm realizing, oh, okay, so that was what that was, and so I think yes, often you don't actually know when you don't know people's backstory. You just meet them and you continue from there.
So I think Chibundu has given us a little bit of like the context of her story. I should do this about Michael's book. And Michael's book is primarily about a woman named Belinda who works as a housemaid in Ghana, but then accompanies, or rather moves to London because her madam's or her auntie's friend needs somebody to help her teenage daughter come out of this weird slump, emotional and mental slump that she needs to be in. And at first, we start out thinking that Belinda is going to be, she's interesting, yes, but then she begins to display very interesting behavior. Like whenever she is upset, she cleans obsessively and uses cleaning as a way to pay for whatever imbalance is happening in her life. And we start to see the cleaning becoming more and more both metaphoric and literal. Mm-hmm. But tell us about this character called Belinda, who just, there's so much happening.
So Belinda was inspired by lots of the house girls that I saw cleaning homes in Kumasi when I would come over from London with my family, and we'd be staying with family in Kumasi and friends of family. And the housemaids, the house girls, were always very present, but incredibly silent. They didn't say a single thing. They always had this sort of look of great fear on their faces because they were kind of expecting to be beaten by someone at any moment. And I was always told very expressly that I shouldn't talk to the house girls, even though they were kind of my age and I might kind of be friends with them, or they might seem like potential friends. I was very strictly told, that's not for you, that's not a no-go area. So they kind of occupied this quite weird space in my imagination where I started creating all sorts of stories about how they must have viewed the houses that they were cleaning, how they must have felt about me as this strange little kind of foreign person, essentially, that they were running around after, but that they couldn't interact with in any way. And so I wanted to think about those characters in a lot more detail. So that's the kind of background to Belinda's story. But I realized when I started writing the novel that just having a story about a character who is obedient and follows the rules and is frightened, it's not that interesting to read that. And also, I don't think it's that realistic either. I don't think people are just sort of one thing or another. I don't think people are just submissive and that's it. So I needed, as I was writing, to kind of give more depth to her character. So yes, she is very obedient and does what she's told, but she also wrestles with the kind of rules that are imposed on her. And she also tries to find ways of dealing with the difficult situations that she finds herself in. So, for example, the cleaning that was mentioned is Belinda's way of, sort of trying to clean off some of the shame she has about herself, about where she's come from. So she originally comes from a village where she's quite ostracized, she's quite cast out from the village folk because of something going on with her mother, which I won't reveal. So she's got this deep sense of shame that she tries to manage by kind of cleaning. She also realizes that cleaning is a way that she can have some authority. It's something that she knows how to do, and she can do it very well. There are all sorts of other things that she encounters in London when she's looking after this 17-year-old girl, Amma. There are all sorts of other things that she experiences that she doesn't understand. the way that people talk, the way that men and women interact with one another, the ways that authority is dealt with. She doesn't get it, but she does understand how to plump the cushions on the sofa and how to make some really good jollof rice. So that's the stuff that she invests her time in. I was also really keen on putting a character at the heart of the novel that the reader was constantly unsettled by. So in one chapter, you are spending time with Belinda and you think, oh, isn't she a vulnerable young woman? I feel sorry for her as a reader, or isn't it an awful experience that she's going through, etc., etc. And then shortly after, she'll do something quite questionable, and you'll think, okay, hold on. But in the last chapter, you're like this, and that because I wanted to show that these people, these figures that we often overlook in our societies, are complex and rounded and have all sorts of contradictions going on within them that are worth us being presented with and thinking about properly, rather than just thinking, oh, it's the cleaner, don't care about her. You know, there's more going on there than first meets the eye.
And now I want to talk about Amma, who is the 17-year-old that Belinda goes to London to see. And the thing with Amma is she's suddenly become like totally withdrawn, totally inaccessible, and her mother thinks another teenager will help Amma come back to herself. And I loved the way you discussed Amma's sexuality, because what's happening with Amma, I told you people there will be spoilers, I'm really sorry, you know, but Amma is...
Amma has a secret. Amma has a secret.
No, but I need to tell the secret because of how you dealt with it. I shouldn't tell. I have to, because it's important. It's actually quite important. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to pull veto power on this one. Yes.
I can find a way of talking about it without mentioning it.
No,
I can
because,
do it.
Well, the thing is, okay, let me tell you why it's important. Because you mentioned, no, it's not going to work. Let me explain. So, Amma's, she's queer. But her queerness is not...
We'll talk about that. But
okay,
keep going,
yes,
keep going.
exactly. Her queerness is not the conversation. It's something that happens, and then we keep on moving through her feelings.
Yeah.
We find out that, irrespective of gender, teenage romances are the same everywhere. We find out that the angst is the same, and so on and so forth. You treated it, in my opinion, very beautifully, because for once it was not this big revelation, but rather it was teenage. And so talk to us about that treatment. I tried. I did my best.
I think when I was thinking about that aspect of Amma's characterization, what I was really interested in was not labeling her in any specific way. So actually, when I was writing the novel, I didn't think about her as queer or lesbian. I thought about her as a young woman, a 17-year-old woman, who was finding out about her own sexuality. And just because she had an encounter with a young woman in her 17th year, that doesn't necessarily mean that she's going to be a lesbian for the rest of her life or whatever. It's something that's happened to her. It's part of her identity in the round. But what I was really keen to explore quite thoroughly and deeply is the idea that there's a tendency in Ghanaian society and in African society at large to not give women that chance to think about their sexuality fully and properly. And there's this urgency for people to define themselves as one way or another, or actually more specifically to define yourself in one way and that's it. Okay? And what I wanted to do with Amma was to sort of to show that that demand that we place on our young people to be one way rather than the other and to conform is deeply damaging. Because although Amma, she does, you're absolutely right, she's able to survive all of the kind of emotional turmoil that comes from the fact that she's had this relationship with this young woman, she's also very deeply aware of the fact that if she were to even begin to talk to her parents or to her kind of Ghanaian community about this relationship that she had with this young woman, she knows that she would be ostracized. And that is deeply painful for her, particularly given that Ghanaians, and again, Africans more broadly, there's this sort of idea that we are, and I've been talking to lots of people about this over the last few days, there's this idea that we are very welcoming and, oh yes, come and sit at my table, oh, you're my sister, you're my brother, etc., etc. But that is not the case if you declare yourself to be different in any kind of way. And that is what Amma's characterization is really trying to do. I'm trying to flag up the hypocrisy of that aspect of our identity, which we need to think a lot more seriously about. So that's what Amma is doing. And also, she's fun. I hope that people enjoy reading her and thinking about her because she's light-hearted, she challenges people, she takes the mickey out of things that other people take really seriously. She's a lot of fun to spend time with, as well as being this quite challenging figure who forces particularly African readers to think about some of their prejudices a bit more clearly.
Thank you. Now, both of you have characters who are African, but who, in Ahmad's case, grew up lived in the UK for some time and came back. Ahmad seemed to me to be almost impossibly naive because he would do things and I'd be like, my guy, you say you suppose know now, you know? But it did show a bit of what might often be a conflict, you know, in principles and in ways of existing, where you have one foot here and the other foot there. So I'd just like you to talk a little bit about that, and then after that, if you can talk about that from Amma's perspective. About just that thing about being African, but growing up in a culture. So again, one foot here, one foot there, and the demands on that. So we'll start with you.
Well, I think Nigerians or Africans in the diaspora, we can sometimes be impossibly naive. So first of all, there's the idea that, and on the roots are all in colonialism, you know, we've gotten this foreign education, you know, now we have a degree, we're engineers. We've seen how things are done, where they work properly. And so now we're going to go back to Africa and, you know, enlighten the natives and show them that running water is not a big deal. Oh my gosh, like I'm just going to turn up and fix Africa. And I think of it sometimes as a second wave of colonization. In the sense that, and I've written about this for The Guardian, I also write for a newspaper in England, in the sense that you come home, first of all, and I mean, Ahmed is not necessarily like this, but you form these cliques, you only want to live on the island. To be honest, I was really surprised that the festival was on the mainland, because, you know, the island is the center of culture. And so, you know, you only want to interact with people who are also part of the diaspora and also all that kind of jazz and extra stuff. So, you know, Ahmed just kind of fall into that character trope where, yes, you know, he's naive. He thinks, you know, I'm going to come back and I'm going to shine a light on, you know, corruption and all of that, and everybody's going to rally behind me and we're going to change Nigeria. And obviously that optimism is needed, but there's also, you need local knowledge as well. You need people that know how to navigate the space you're rocking up in, or else you just be doomed to make the same mistakes of all your predecessors with all their high hopes, and also a sort of like naive arrogance, as really. And so yeah, that was the character of Ahmed. And what was particularly interesting for me to explore with him was that he's a member of the elite, and his parents and his family wealth also comes from quite questionable sources. And also, certainly, you know, sometimes you meet these people in England, you know, the children of governors, former presidents that have now become activists. And, you know, they are speaking out against corruption. And I'm like, inside your house, Unko, before the one inside your house first, before, you know, you become this anti-corruption crusader. And I mean, it's not to say, oh, you know, it's just the irony of the position. I mean, you know, kudos to them for, you know, wanting to see a new Nigeria. But it's kind of like, this is ironic. So I wanted to explore that as well.
I like how you actually talked about a new Nigeria, because you described a very interesting Nigeria. And again, there were many juxtapositions of, you know, life. What was normal for one was not normal for the other, and how people, no matter what situation, created their own normal, their own community. It's actually a story of different communities and intersections and so on. And it made me wonder, for you, when you finished reading that, did you have a moment where you said, if I could change one thing about this Nigeria, or if I could take something from this book and like sprinkle magic dust and make it happen in the rest of the country, this is the thing that I would change?
To be honest, it's not obviously, yeah, there are a lot of things you want to change in Nigeria, like NEPA and all of that. Yes, but I think in the book, what was interesting to me to explore is less of a change than I want to write about stuff that I don't often see. Just the sense of community that happens in places like Lagos. and how people from all parts of Nigeria and all parts of West Africa, they come to Lagos as strangers and they come together and they build something. And there's actually a lot to learn from the way we do, diversity in a place like this. I mean, sometimes, when I go to, speak on panels abroad, etc., and they'll say, Christians are killing Muslims in Nigeria. What do you have to say about that? And I'm like, where are they killing themselves? They're not killing themselves in Lagos. In Lagos, you will have mosque. Afar will do his own. Then you have the church. Then they'll put their loudspeaker on the road. They will do their own. Everybody will be blasting. You have so much side by side, so much melding, so many different communities. I mean, the current governor, I loved the campaign that he ran on. I mean, we can discuss whether or not he actually achieved any of the things he had campaigned for. That's a separate story. But one of the songs in his campaign jingle, it was Yemi Alade that sang it. It was Gbogbo Ala Leko, tam, 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 tam. And that basically just means everybody owns Lagos. And there is a sort of Lagosian unity that I see. It's not that we always get along, but I was just interested in those communities under the bridges. Those people band together and, just out of necessity, they come together to just survive in this place. And I wanted to write about that.
It's, for those of you who haven't read it, it's actually very powerful, watching the communities shift and evolve and break apart and come together in very unexpected ways. So can we go to, can somebody tell me how many minutes I have? I have 5 more before we do audience. Fantastic. Okay. So can you talk to me about Amma's experience as an African person growing up in the UK?
Yeah, so I think when I was shaping Amma as a character, I was drawing a lot on my own experiences of being someone who is very proudly Ghanaian and grew up in a household where we were always very much told that that was a cornerstone of our identity. And we came back to Ghana every few years and so on. But equally, someone that felt very at home in the UK. And that sort of dual identity thing was also complicated by the fact that, as I was saying before, I don't speak Twi very well. So when I go back home to Kumasi and I'm trying to communicate with my family, with elders, that is very difficult. So trying to connect with the people that I'm constantly told are my true family is really, really hard. And in Amma, I wanted to kind of look at that in a bit more detail. And there's one passage in particular which I think really summarizes that, where Belinda and Amma's mum go to a kind of Ghanaian gathering in South London. And Belinda, for a long time, has been feeling really ostracized and unsure of herself because she's just arrived in London. But at this party, with all of these Ghanaians, this is Belinda's territory, and Amma suddenly feels unsure of herself because she can't speak the language in this room. So everyone around her is speaking in Twi and actually insulting her and making all sorts of weird comments about her that Belinda translates for her. And that moment where Belinda's able to kind of bridge the cultural divide for Amma is the moment that their friendship starts to really blossom. And that's one of the things I really wanted to kind of hammer home in the novel, is that the kind of difficulties that Amma has felt as a British Ghanaian, that sense of outsiderhood, of not really understanding how to interact with her own heritage. The moment that Belinda starts to unlock that for them is the moment that their friendship becomes more solid and more meaningful. I think also one of the things that's tricky for Amma and people like me who were born in the UK but have roots in Ghana, one of the things that's really tricky is that often your parents are kind of pleased that you've kind of fully assimilated into British society. Oh, he went to Oxford, congratulations, etc. Okay. But then when you start to question the traditional values of Ghana with the values that you've acquired from going to Oxford, there's all sorts of chaos that happens. And that sort of rub between those two things, the older generation find really difficult. And that's one of the things that Amma is wrestling with in the novel. She has got this mother who is very proud that she's going to this elite girls' school and she's performing very well in exams and etc. But when Amma starts to behave in ways that her white peers' parents would perceive as ordinary teenage behavior, Amma's mother can't handle it. She doesn't know, why are you talking to me like that? Why are you looking at me like that? What's this sulking for? She doesn't understand it and she won't stand for it. So that kind of contradiction, I think, is at the heart of a lot of British Ghanaian families, actually. what kind of aspects of Britishness do you want your children to absorb? What bits do you want them to reject? Why is it up to you as parents, actually, to decide? They made that very bold decision to move from Ghana to the UK and shape their own identities through that journey. Why won't you let your own children have that ability to define their own futures?
Okay, so we have questions coming right after this, but we're going to have the authors read their passages for us.
This is so exciting. I've never read in Pidgin from Welcome to Lagos before, because I hate when I'm in an audience that doesn't understand Pidgin and they say, read from Pidgin, read from... I'm like, I'm not a performing monkey, please. I'm like, why should I read it if you don't understand what I'm saying? So this is so exciting. So this is Chike and Yemi. They are two former soldiers and they are looking for work in Lagos. And it appears that they have finally found work. Chike and Yemi had found work in the end. Not work that would turn them into laborers, nor work that was particularly challenging, but it was work nonetheless, and close enough to a military nature to be familiar. They had been at a crossroads waiting for a gap for pedestrians when the traffic warden fell to the ground. Her colleague ran out of the arrest hut, shouting, "Bianca, oh!" Chike approached. He had a smattering of first aid knowledge from military school, basic skills in wound dressing and artificial respiration. The male warden waved him away. "Abeg, help us control traffic." Behind him, the warden was hoisting his colleague into the arrest hut. The woman was conscious, but she let herself be dragged inside. "This your uniform too tight," he said. "Godwin, waiting. You want naked me? Waiting concern me with your breast. You dey squash this pikin for inside your stomach. Abeg, leave my cloth. I've been telling you, Bianca, pregnant woman is not supposed to be doing this work. You, unko, see your stomach. You know be pregnant man. Bianca, go home to your husband's house. Abeg, leave me, Joe. Now who they control traffic?" The woman, Bianca, sat up and called to Chike. "Oga, well done, oh." He turned to acknowledge her greeting. She would have been pretty if her eyes had not been crossed, gazing at each other over her shapely nose. Either she or Godwin had freed her stomach from her uniform, and now it rested taut on her knees, her belly button protruding like a small fruit. "You are doing this work well, oh. If to say you be policeman, you can just continue. Make I go home and rest." "Tomorrow, unko," Godwin asked, "if you faint again." "I could come tomorrow as well," Chike said, halting one flow and beginning another. "Or my friend over there could come." "Oh, you are two," Godwin said. "What's your name?" "Yemi." "And you?" "Chike." "Oh, Boibo. Which side are you from?" Imbise. "My wife is from there," Godwin said. Chike had lost track of how long the right stream had been moving. He put up a hand to halt them. "Not yet. No, they cannot come again. Just that next time you will give them chance for longer. Oh yeah, make those other people they come." "What work are you doing right now?" Godwin asked. I'll stop there.
I actually loved that encounter. It was incredible. I loved it. Okay, so Michael?
Okay, so I'm going to read from the 10th chapter of the novel. I suppose before I sort of start reading, things that you need to know. Belinda has been in London at this point for about 2 weeks. And Nana, who's Amma's mother, so Nana is the person that she's sort of really working for, Nana has decided that Belinda and she should go shopping. What else do you need to know? The only other thing that you need to know is that, and lots of people know this, I'm sure, Abroni is the Twi word for white people. So they're out shopping. Belinda walked behind Nana as they made their way along noisy Brixton High Road. Flat, late summer heat hung from Belinda's shoulders. The sky was bored, the traffic was angry. Everything around them beeped or screamed. People on bikes turned around to swear at people in cars. 3 striped white vans with swirling blue lights moaned. Buses bent round corners looking like sick caterpillars. Both Nana and Belinda were careful to avoid stubby black bins that choked on packets and bottles and that made Nana hiss, "Lambeth Council." like those words were bad kenke on her tongue. A tall man with wheels on his shoes sailed through it all peacefully. He overtook them until he became a thin, upright line between all the bodies in the distance. There was no space, the road was too full, the pavement too narrow to hold all the people pushing along it. Nana marched on, pointing forward with two certain fingers, swinging her yellow handbag with the little LVs on it. Belinda tried to match the pace, but she kept nearly bumping into everyone because the surroundings pulled at her attention so much. On her left, outside a huge shop, a group of children played silver drums that were like the bucket she'd used when fetching water from the stream when the village pump wasn't working. The children's music was a wobbling sound that shimmered on the air. Two women with flopping hats stopped to dance in front of the band, wiggling their bottoms and holding their breasts. Near an even bigger store, muscled men wearing small vests had arranged themselves in a circle. They casually held big guns made from colored plastic, a joke of an army. They pressed their pretend weapons into the ground as though steadying themselves. A larger circle of girls formed around the men. The girls picked at the small jewels growing out of their belly buttons, touched the drawings on their arms, talked to the little dogs at their heels that bit at nothing. Every few seconds, one of the men pulled a trigger and water sprayed. The girls shouted like they were surprised, the dogs became furious, and the men all shook hands with one another. Nana muttered. Belinda wished she could make out the words, but Nana seemed to be trying very hard to speak quietly. Belinda knew what crowds were like. She had battled through New Tafu. She had been in packs of brave pedestrians who had crossed the crazy junction near Kojokanin Street. But it was different when so many of the rushing faces of the crowd were white. Obviously, she had seen Abroni before. Leonardo DiCaprio and Julia Roberts in the magazines Auntie left on the bathroom floor, the big men in the news, the families at Heathrow. Belinda was familiar with the idea that their hair was weird, their voices weirder, like the sound ignored the mouth and came out through the nose. But here in London, they were even stranger. They seemed so determined or focused. Yes, their pale stares were very focused on something important. And they themselves were important too, with their heads up and shoulders square and faces on the edge of anger. They certainly were too important to notice her. But if, for a second, they did let their gazes drop on her, would they dislike what they saw? Would the sight of her bring more red to their faces? Stepping aside for a child who was held by a stretchy leash surely meant for one of those yapping dogs, Belinda wondered if Nana had ever felt the same foolish fear of whites. She wondered how Nana had quieted it. Because how could you live here with that prickling fear? How could you breathe, think, do anything? Thank you.
So we're going to take questions now. I'm going to appeal, as we must do at these gatherings, to please keep your questions brief. We will ask, I know that a lot of people will have comments, but if you can ask questions, that would be fantastic. How many more minutes do we have? Okay.
Very precise.
Okay. Can we take our first question?
Good morning, everybody. The name is John. My question is for Chibundu. Sorry. So, reading the story, Welcome to Lagos, there is this, we feel Amma and Chike, they're like the father and mother of the house. But there is nothing really about that reunion. I want to ask, is it deliberate not to delve into the, or the story just didn't come that way?
Are you trying to ask me why they don't have sex?
No.
Like, I'm sorry, I don't understand.
No, not why they didn't have sex, but I felt they were like, yes, going to,
All
yeah.
right,
That's
okay.
right.
What's a Nollywood generation? You want the romance. So, I sort of leave it open-ended where there's something developing between them. But I think, and also this is back to your question about Oma's trauma. It's not necessarily discussed a lot in the text, but how it's discussed is how she develops relationships from there. And obviously she's come out of a physically abusive relationship. And I suppose it's not really just in a space to just, and especially because they are homeless at a point and so on and so forth. So I leave it sort of open-ended that the story is developing. Yeah.
Any other questions?
I'm wondering how you are feeling. Chibundu, you hinted at it, that it feels so good to be in front of a Lagosian audience. How do you both feel about reading in this space, and what is the difference that you find doing that here versus doing that abroad?
That's a really interesting question, and I think often a lot of the events that I've done so far for this sort of book tour have been in the UK. Lots of them have been in London, and obviously London is a very cosmopolitan city, so people are fairly broad-minded when it comes to issues of race and sexuality and so on. But when I've done a few events outside of London, and I've read quite sort of standard passages where not that much exciting stuff's going on from the book, I've found myself having to do a lot of explaining and justifying who I am and why I've written this book, and why it would be of interest to them. So there's a lot of, I don't know, having to kind of justify yourself that goes on when you're speaking to white audiences in rural areas, non-city areas. I think also there's that sort of slightly, I don't know, uncomfortable thing of being a kind of spectacle. Oh, look at this lovely, clever black man who's come to talk to us today, you know? And it's a really deeply uncomfortable thing, because I want to talk about the characters. I want to talk about the story. I want to talk about the issues that are involved in this book. I don't want to be a spectacle. I don't want to be a kind of object of fun that they can go and talk about at their dinner party after the event. You know, so it's a really complicated thing that goes on when you're speaking in non-urban environments, and you're kind of there in some ways to fulfill a diversity quota, and often kind of who you are and your racial identity overshadows the work that you've produced, and that's quite troubling. That can be really troubling. So it's very nice to be here and to look at the novel in a different way, to look at the novel in a way that doesn't involve me having to sort of explain so much stuff, but instead to see what Africans think of this story, which is about African life to a certain extent.
To be honest, I'm going to be honest with you guys. Like, I'm very disappointed with this audience because I was expecting fire for fire. Like, I've already prepared myself for fight. I thought people would be saying, you live in London, why are you writing a book called Welcome to Lagos? How dare you? This one. And everybody is just, are we in Lagos, please? Like, I don't understand. What is going on? So, yeah, I mean, it's very good. It's very good to be home. It's good, the kind of questions Arit is asking me. And yeah, it's just good to be in front of a Nigerian audience. You know, I can read Pidgin, you understand what I'm saying, and there's no explanation necessary. You know, like the context is clear to everybody in the room. You know, you understand the battle between the island and the mainland. When the island is sinking, we on the mainland, we will still have our houses. You understand the battle between Nigerian jollof and Ghanaian jollof. You know the winner of the battle between Nigerian jollof and Ghanaian jollof. Like, it's just good. It's just good.
Don't start it. Don't do this. Don't do this. Things were going so well. Oh.
But yeah, it's good. It's good to be home.
Influenced by someone they know or someone they've met. They say, okay, I got this character, or rather, this trait was from this person, and the way that person looks, I got from that person. Was that the same when you were telling your stories? Is there anybody in your life that you would say influenced the characters you ended up writing?
Yeah, I've got a slightly complicated answer to that question in that I don't think that any of the characters were directly influenced by specific people, but one of the things I wanted to do when I was writing this novel was to think about my mother in a kind of serious way that I was able to do because I was grown up. So obviously when you're a teenager, you look at your parents and you think, oh, they don't understand me, why don't they understand me, etc., etc. And then when you get into your 20s, you start to kind of think about the decisions they've made in their lives, their struggles, their story in a more sensitive way. And what I really wanted to work through in the novel was what's often kind of perceived by lots of Europeans as a kind of African hardness. So whereas white parents will kind of hug and kiss their children like this and kind of give them all sorts of attention, whatever, my mum was slightly more distant than that. And I wanted to kind of think through what was going on with that, because her distance was not a sign of lacking love in any way, shape or form. It was very much a response to the world that she'd grown up in. People didn't do hugging and kissing in Kumasi in 1950. Are you mad? No. Why? So what I wanted to think about was the conditions that had shaped my mum and her behaviour, and also more than that, to think about the profound resilience that African women like my mum of her generation have demonstrated in the ways that they have coped with situations back home and the situations they encounter when they go to America, the UK. The profound resilience of those women is something that continues to amaze and inspire me. And so in this novel, it's centered very much on African women's experiences and the difficulties that they face and the inventive and quite beautiful ways sometimes that they deal with those difficulties. And one of the ways that they deal with those difficulties is by forming friendships, and friendships between African women, as I've seen it by observing the things that my sisters have gone through, the things that my mother has gone through. Those friendships are a source of salvation. They save them and they nourish them as well. So in answer to your question again, it wasn't a direct kind of novel that was like, oh, here's the autobiography of my mother, but her journey and her response to the world around her and the world that she came from really informed what I was trying to do with the three women at the heart of this novel.
I mean, a brief answer is, well, first of all, even if they were based on real characters, I can't tell you because it's illegal. You know, in the beginning of the book, they say any resemblance between any real people is an accident. But it's more based on, there's some things that are based on real events. So I have a massacre at the beginning, and that was based on, inspired is not really the word I'm looking for, on what happened on OD. And there's an interview in the book between a politician and a BBC journalist. You need to watch Obasanjo's Hard Talk interview. Steve! The guy's name was Steve. And he was like, they asked him a question about Yabo Obasanjo's alleged corruption. And he was like, can you ask Bill Clinton that? Yabo is an adult. So yes, the defensiveness of of African politicians sometimes when confronted by Western journalists. Yeah, so watch that interview. Obasanjo, BBC Hard Talk.
We have to round up now, but I'm going to say that these two books are journeys through that on the surface seem really simple, but the more you read, the more complex and the more entwined you get. And I'm going to end with a few lines from Hold that I think is something that any creative would really appreciate hearing, where Belinda says, will you take your own advice? Be nice to yourself also and really think about what is going to be nice for you in the long run. If you get what I mean. Maybe because maybe a candlelight dinner with some boys even going to mix you up even more. It might make you less on your own for one evening perhaps, but maybe it isn't something you truly want. Maybe it's something you don't even need to do, because maybe your own way is the best way for you. Thank you very much.
A big round of applause for these amazing creatives. So while they're doing their group photo, I just want you to know that right away in this hall, you have the reality of Black Britishness, with Adebantu, Diana Evans, David Olusoga, and Charlie Brinkhurst Cuff. And in the Namdi Azikiwe Hall, We have the Bintu and Homecoming panel with Yinkai Bukun, BC Ajakpon, Bobo Motayo, and Nisan Rewani. You basically have 2 minutes together, but wait. There's more. These authors are going to be signing books. If you come out of this hall and you turn left, at the end there, that's our signing area. So if you want to purchase this particular title, now is the time to go there. Any of these titles, you go there now, you pay, and you can just line up and get your book signed. Okay, next panel will start in 2 minutes. Thank you.